Good evening, everybody. Wow, that's loud. That's like the voice of God. I'm David Shivers. I'm the president of the Des Moines Register. It's my extreme honor and privilege to welcome you all tonight to this event. This is an event to talk with Andie Dominick, and it will be conducted by, moderated by our executive editor, Carol Hunter, really to celebrate the 17th Pulitzer Prize for the Des Moines Register. I think that's worth a round of applause. This is the fourth Pulitzer for editorial writing. It's been a little while since we've won a Pulitzer for editorial writing. The last one was 1956. You can do the math. But we have a long tradition of being recognized by the Pulitzer Committee for the powerful work that we do across national reporting, cartooning, photography, as well as editorial writing. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Carol to actually introduce Andie, but I just want to say that the work that Andie does day in and day out is very representative of the work that our entire newsroom does every day. And while we don't do this kind of work for the awards, it's always nice to be acknowledged with an honor like this one. So with that, I'll introduce Carol Hunter.
Okay, everyone hear me now? Thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm so thrilled to be here with Andie, winner of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing. The Register is hosting the event this evening to allow you to get to know Andie a little bit more, to learn about what drives her and what led her on the path to winning journalism's most prestigious prize. I'll interview Andie for the first part of the evening, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. So you all got cards when you came in, and if you think of questions as we go along, just write down your question, and then you'll pass them to the aisles as we get ready for that segment. One of the first things to know about Andie is that she's an Iowan through and through. Both of her parents hail from Iowa. Her mother, Marlene, is from Rolfe, and her father, Ray, is from Lamar's, and they're here tonight. Could you guys stand up? Like so many before and after, they made their way to Des Moines. Andie's a proud graduate of Hoover High School. All right. She earned her bachelor's and master's at Iowa State University. Okay, a few more. This will be a night for celebration. I hope there's lots of claps. She and her husband, Doug Wolf, live here in Des Moines still. Doug is here, if you want to stand up and say hello.
And Bailey.
And also her daughter, Bailey. They have 3 grown children. Bailey here is a student at DMAC. Their middle child, Jordan, is a student at Iowa State. And their older son, Jacob, is in the Army, and he's stationed in Hawaii. And he does Japanese translation, a language he started learning here at Central Academy in Des Moines. The other thing to know about Andie is that her Des Moines Register and Tribune ties go way deep. Her father, Ray, here was a linotype operator at the paper, and she and her brother delivered the paper.
The afternoon.
Yeah. The Tribune.
And the Sunday Register. Yeah.
A myriad of skills and characteristics make Andie a great editorial writer. She's a clear writer and thinker. She's a deep researcher. She burns with righteous anger when the powerful oppress the powerless. She's fearless in her conviction, and she has no quit. When she sees something that's wrong, she writes and writes and writes some more. Much of tonight's conversation will be about how her personal experiences with healthcare ignited an interest and passion in learning about our healthcare system and writing about it with an eye toward making it better for all Americans. So Andie, some of your first memories about illness and doctors and the need for healthcare stem because your older sister was a diabetic. You watched your parents, your mother in particular, kind of have to almost take on the system on her behalf. So tell us about that and then your own diagnosis with diabetes.
Yeah, so can you hear me? Is that on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my sister was born actually in 1959 and was diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 2. So that would have been, 1961. So there weren't very many people or children in Des Moines with diabetes. As far as we know, my sister was one of the first children in the Des Moines schools. So my mother, we didn't have Google then, we didn't have communities of people, so my parents really had to maybe I have to move this. Yeah. Is that better? Is that better? Yeah, totally. So my parents had to really be advocates, and my mom had to, kind of on her own learn about diabetes. One of the stories we tell is, in the 60s, there were no disposable syringes. So they had a syringe that had to be boiled, and my mom was the person who would, she called a medical supply company begging for disposable syringes for her 2-year-old daughter so she could have sharper needles. And so I grew up, in a house where we knew all about diabetes, and then when I was about 9, I was a very skinny little kid. And I think my parents and family knew that I probably had diabetes too. So we didn't have a way to test at home other than urine. You put 5 drops of urine and 10 drops of water into a test tube, and you drop this tube in. And I was about 9 when we did that, and you could see that I had sugar in my urine, and then I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Back then, you spent a lot of time in the hospital when you were diagnosed with diabetes. It's different now. So,
you talked about having to practice on oranges, giving yourself shots.
Yeah, it's funny if you're diagnosed now with diabetes, your doctor's basically just going to send you home. I mean, with education, but back then I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and I think it was me, and every day I would go to this patient education, me and like 4 50-year-olds. And what some of the things we did were that you would practice giving shots to pieces of fruit, to oranges and drawing insulin and things like that. So yeah, I did that for a few weeks.
It wasn't always the safest path as you worked your way through your teenage years. You described some rebellion along the way.
Yeah. Well, if you know about diabetes, I mean, it is a disease that has to be carefully managed. I now check my blood sugar 10 times a day, and I give, 7 shots of insulin a day. And you have to just constantly monitor that. But as a teenager, like all teenagers, you don't do what you're supposed to do. And so I stopped giving my shots. I think I was probably about 16, and ended up in the emergency room where I'll always remember the emergency room doctor saying to me, if you want to be alive when you're 20, you'll start doing what you're supposed to do. And so I started to do what I was supposed to do for the most part.
So today there are implanted insulin pumps, other advances that make it much easier to manage this disease, but it's still a serious chronic disease. You've talked and written about how being diagnosed with diabetic retinopathy in your early 20s. I've often heard you sing the praises of University of Iowa hospitals and clinics and the ophthalmologists there, saying that they're a national treasure, and they often are ranked very highly in national rankings. Can you tell us about exactly how many eye surgeries have you had?
Yeah, well, it was when I'd finished college and I decided to head out to Alaska on this 3-month adventure with a friend of mine, and we were out camping for all that time, and my eyes just, my vision just filled with blood. I was probably 23, I was in my early 20s, and I came back home and visited an ophthalmologist in Des Moines who told me I was going to go blind. But I ended up in Iowa City, where I had about more than a dozen eye surgeries there. I was lucky. The head of retina at the University of Iowa sort of was taking on diabetic patients, people who'd had diabetes for many years. And so I had many laser surgeries and a vitrectomy. A vitrectomy is where they cut your eye open and they suck out all the vitreous fluid because it's filled with broken blood vessels. So there's saline in that eye. So that's been 25 years ago. And I go back every year and I credit them with saving my vision. Yeah.
So it's from these personal experiences you began developing your view of healthcare as a fundamental necessity and right. You've even said that your father used to tell you as a child you had to get a good education, get a good job so that you would have insurance because no one would insure you. Tying health insurance to jobs is one of the anomalies of the American system. How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, think about how strange that is, you know, when you have an 8 or 9-year-old kid and my parents who worked for insurance companies, that was one of their first thoughts was this little girl's going to grow up and no one's going to sell her insurance because before Obamacare, you're underwritten. You know what I mean? If you don't have a job that offers insurance, you're not going to get it. So even as a kid, I knew I had to have health insurance. So I was going to have to get a job with health insurance or work. Yeah, and America has this, the United States has this unique system, you know, of tying health insurance to jobs, which that's changed now. Obamacare allowed people to buy insurance on exchanges, and you don't need to now get your insurance through a job. But I always think that's what motivated me. I mean, you have to have insulin. You have to have test strips. And those things are expensive, and you're not going to be alive without those things as a diabetic. So I think that's kind of driven me over the years to try to make sure people have health insurance.
So you told me that you went off to Iowa State and studied English with really not much idea of a career path. But you also, in graduate school, sold a book, Needles, a memoir of growing up with diabetes. Talk about how this all came about. And I will note that there are books out for sale out in the lobby, and Andie will happily autograph those as well.
Yeah. So my sister had been diabetic, and I was diabetic, but my sister then died in her early 30s. And so I had, and we were pretty close. And I wrote an essay. I was in college and an English major, and I wrote an essay, a 6-page essay about her funeral called A Rented Room. And I won this Writer's Digest contest. And I was living in a trailer park in Ankeny, going to Iowa State, and a book agent in New York was leaving voicemails on my answering machine, which I didn't know I didn't call her back because I didn't think, you know, it was real. But she finally got a hold of me and asked me to write a book about growing up with diabetes, and then sold it to Simon & Schuster, and I wrote that in about 6 months, I think, and it allowed me to just kind of chronicle my life and my sister and my family. So.
And how many languages has that been translated into?
I'm not sure. I mean, Dutch and German, and I'm not sure, but a few, yeah.
Okay. And I would think that would make the process in getting your master's, your dissertation, a little easier.
Yeah, I was telling Carol this. I'd forgotten about that, but I sold the book, and then I was starting graduate school, which I made it my thesis, which became, I think, tough for the professors to critique, you know, because it was already sold, and so I remember sitting in that defense, kind of like there wasn't much they wanted to edit in it because that was up to the publisher to do. So, yeah, that made it a lot easier.
So, how did you come to be hired by the Register as an editorial writer?
Yeah, so I was teaching English then. I finished my master's and was teaching English at Iowa State, and my dad, I think, saw an ad for an editorial writer at the Des Moines Register, and I applied with not much journalism experience. I was the editor of the Hoover Challenger back in high school, but then had been an English major, hanging out at the M Shop and creative writing and doing all that. So Dick, took a chance on me and hired me. He said, "You're a good writer, and we'll teach you how to do the job," and he did exactly that. So Dick and Bill Leonard and kind of that old guard really trained me how to be a journalist.
I really do give Dick a tremendous amount of credit because to go outside the usual people who've worked in a newsroom, people who have gone to journalism school, but just to see what a talent you have for writing and also critical thinking. So Andie and I did a little math and guesstimate that she's probably written about 2,500 editorials in her 17 years at the Register. Even on large opinion staff, editorial writers have to be generalist and write about lots of different topics. Andie has written editorials on everything from the local schools to hunting and fishing regulations to state and national economic policy, political endorsements, of course, and health care. One of the hallmarks of Andie's work, even though she never was a reporter, is that she does lots of reporting before writing her editorials. I mean, I've been guilty of this, and if you look at lots of editorials across the country, really they're little more than taking a reporter's work, then you take the top part of the editorial and say, here's a problem, then you outlined everything that the reporter has written, and then at the bottom you say, someone should fix this. Andie starts often with our own staff's reporting, and she really does credit our fine reporting staff for surfacing many of the ideas and giving kind of the basis for the start of her work on editorials. But then she'll do her own research, she'll do interviews, she'll look at academic research, things like the Congressional Research Service. And sometimes she'll also just strike out on her own and take on topics that the reporting staff hasn't taken on. One of the first big series that she did at the paper was just in 2002, just a year after she started. She did a series about the low Medicaid reimbursements in Iowa, and the overall theme was how Medicare cheats Iowa. The editor at the time was named Paul Anger. He was so proud of that that he packaged it up like this and sent it to all 435 members of Congress. Now, it took several years, but they finally did at least adjust Medicare reimbursements a little bit. Then in 2004, one of your important series was called The Forgotten Middle. Could you tell us about how the series came about and its main findings?
Yeah, that was the brainchild of Dick Doak. I think probably many of you know Dick, and it was an election year, and Dick said, boy, they're starting to pay attention to the middle class again. And so let's kind of figure out who the middle class is. You know, the middle class is really as much a state of mind as it is really an income level. So we started by looking at census data and figuring out the median in Iowa. You know, the median income about $48,000, the median house price about $82,000 at that time, and we put out a call to Iowans who considered themselves middle class, and we got a lot of responses, and then I drove around the state interviewing these people, single moms, two-parent families, all kinds of different people, and we used their stories to kind of decide what can you do to really help the middle class, you know, to even level the playing field for everybody. And the editorials focused then on providing health care for people, libraries, education, affordable higher education, amenities, you know, the basic things that government can do to kind of make sure everybody can start from a fair place in life. And so that was the forgotten middle, yeah. I'd forgotten about that until Not really.
One of the topics Andie's also written a fair amount about is about child welfare, and this is another place where her personal experiences have intersected with her work. All three of your children were adopted out of foster care. What led to that decision?
Yeah, so my husband Doug is a social worker, and we'd been married a few years, and I think he had a work training to go to, is I think how it started, and I went along, and one way or another we ended up getting a foster care license. You know, I'd had diabetes for a long time at that point and a lot of eye problems, and I knew I wasn't going to have children. So we did our adoption classes, and at our home study, a social worker came in and she showed us these pictures of these two little boys. And she said, these little boys are in foster care, and the family who has them is older and they don't want to adopt them. And so we said, okay, we'll take them. So that was Jake and Jordan, who they were 1 and 3, and now they're 23 and 21. And we adopted the boys, and they were actually in foster care for about, in our house for about a year. So I got to know their biological mom pretty well because we did home visits still. And then by the time Jake went to kindergarten, they were adopted and had our name. And then a few years later, DHS called me at work at the register and said, we have this little girl, Bailey. And I remember I said to Dick, I think I'm gonna, we're gonna take this little girl into foster care. And I remember Dick saying, I can't think of anything better for you to take a day off for. And so Bailey arrived, and that was 16 years ago or so, and we adopted you. So I have a real passion for foster care. Child welfare, the primary goal of child welfare should always be to keep children with their biological families. That's so important, but sometimes that just can't happen. And so you need families who can, who will take care of children.
We've often talked about how we end up writing a lot about child welfare and foster care in often sometimes kind of negative ways, because inevitably there will be abuses, but it is such an important system for families and for our state, country.
Yeah.
So I'm going to mention one other series of editorials that weren't related to healthcare before we do a deeper dive on those. And in 2014, Andie was a finalist for the Pulitzer for a series of editorials about job licensing. And once again, it kind of had an intersection with your real life, but how did that series of editorials come about?
Yeah, my oldest son was graduating from high school and getting ready to go to Iowa State, and his girlfriend at the time, who is now his wife, was about to go to cosmetology school. And I was talking to them in the kitchen, and I remember her just talking about how much she was going to have to take out in student loans and how long this was going to take. And my mom had asked questions, I think, about cosmetology schools for a long time. In Iowa, they're for-profit schools, and sometimes the student loan debt can be $30,000 or more. And Iowa also has the highest requirement for licensure. You need 2,100 hours of training to legally cut hair, in this state. So it started with cosmetology, but then we tackled a lot of other job licenses too. You need a job license for, to interpret sign language. You need state licenses for all these jobs. So we ended up doing a bigger series on how that creates a lot of problems for people, to be able to enter professions they want to enter. So.
Okay, so on healthcare, Andie has investigated many different topics and many aspects in depth. One of her bigger series was on long-term care, and that was written in 2007, and it was called Assurance Denied. So tell us about some of the people you met as you researched that series and kind of what those editorials were about.
Yeah, so just to recap real quick, long-term care insurance is not like health insurance. If you need to go into a nursing home, Medicare is not going to cover that long-term, and neither is your private health insurance. So long-term care insurance is sold specifically to cover nursing home stays. I was trying to remember how, if someone called me or how this started, but the first thing we did in the editorial department was I asked the insurance division for complaints about long-term care insurance. And the insurance commissioner at the time, Susan Voss, they gave me the copies of the complaints, but they redacted all the names. So we couldn't talk to any of the people. And I was going back today looking at what we did, and we actually asked the insurance division to send letters to those people. They wouldn't tell me their names, but they did send letters for us. And so they said, if you want to talk to the Des Moines Register, people who'd filed complaints, contact Andie Dominick. And ultimately, people just came out of the woodwork with stories of how they had purchased long-term care insurance, sometimes many, many years ago, you know, and then they got sick or they got Alzheimer's, and the insurance company wouldn't pay. The other thing about long-term care insurance is it's the kind of thing you buy, you know, maybe when you're 50, and you don't file a claim until you're 80. So in those 30 years, you know, an insurer can go out of business. They can, you know, raise the rates several times. So one woman we interviewed, Marge Bodie, I actually would work a lot of times with their children because these people would be 90 and their children were in their 60s. But Marge had Alzheimer's and had paid $71,000 in premiums, you know, over 20 years into her long-term care insurance policy. And her husband found a home for her, but it wasn't a nursing home. And that was the only thing her policy covered. It had to be a nursing home. Well, assisted living didn't exist, right, when her policy had been written, so she was in an assisted living center. Ultimately, Roxanne Conlon took her case and sued that company, and the company did pay. But even when our photographer at the time, Mary Chin, would go to places to take photos of people in nursing homes who I'd been interviewing, and I remember her telling me she was stopped by other people in the home saying, I have the same story. You know, she was taking a photograph of someone and another person said, my insurer is not paying either. So we had, you know, a lot of people turned out. Ultimately, the insurance commissioner, to her credit, did a good job. She launched a review of this. The legislature created the long-term care, like a person in the insurance division to take complaints, and so that was.
I was editor of the editorial pages when Andie did that series, and I remember someone writing me after and saying, kind of taking us to task a little bit, saying that, oh yes, there used to be a problem with this kind of insurance, and pretty much acknowledged that basically the actuarial work was off because they just hadn't figured how long people would live and just how much more expensive long-term care would become. But this person was arguing that, oh, it's so much better now. And there certainly are people who encourage sales of those policies, but I think all of our research says with your eyes wide open.
Well, I think the most telling thing is, I remember saying to Susan Voss and then the subsequent insurance commissioner, I said, do you personally have long-term care insurance? And neither of them did. And I think that's pretty telling, and it's tough, you know, insurance agents in the industry, they have their position, and those actuaries, it's true. I mean, I think what happened is early on, the policies that were sold 30 and 40 years ago, they didn't think people would keep paying into them as long as they did, and they didn't think people would live that long. So, you know, but it's an insurance you have to be careful about, I think.
Another frequent aspect of healthcare that Andie has written a lot about is mental health care. One of the most horrifying cases you've written about recently involved Tiffany Carlton, someone you'd met. Tell us her story.
Yeah, Tiffany, I don't know if any of you remember, but years ago we used to have this on the editorial pages, what was called the Young Adult Contributors Board. And I think because I was the youngest person on the staff at that time, I got the task of being in charge of that board. And we would ask, you know, people under 30 to write essays for us. And Tiffany at the time was incarcerated in Mitchellville. But she had saw this in the paper and she wanted to write her story. And she became one of the members of that Young Adult Contributor Board. And she had gone to prison because she had stolen some narcotics from a pharmacy. And her essay was all about how grateful she was to the Department of Corrections, that they had saved her life. And over the years, I kept in contact with her. And a few months back, maybe 6 months ago, she called. And she'd been struggling, and she had been living in a halfway house and was having, hearing voices, and ultimately landed in the Lynn County Jail, where she dug her eye out. And what we wrote about was that, like her gouging her eye out in jail. And that was the story we told, and it was just such a reminder that mental health, that it's beyond just the healthcare system, that the jails and prisons and emergency rooms have to be prepared to help people. So ultimately, she also ended up at the University of Iowa, where she got a prosthetic eye and is getting treatment now and help. But.
So, 2008 presidential election, healthcare was one of the main issues. Eventually led to adoption of the Affordable Care Act, signed by President Obama, often called Obamacare. Negotiations over this law for nearly 2 years before its adoption led to you writing lots of editorials. And you and our editorial board as a whole initially wasn't that much of a fan of Obamacare. Why not?
Yeah, we had long advocated for sort of universal system of health insurance. And when Medicare and Medicaid were created in 1965, it was a Democratic Congress and a Democrat in the White House. And they created those two programs in '65. And so Obama landed in the White House, and voters gave him a Democratic House and Senate at the time. And that was an opportunity to reform this country's healthcare system. And we pushed for a kind of Medicare for all system for many years, but the reality was that they were trying to negotiate with Republicans, and we ended up, Obamacare ended up being a system that pretty heavily relies on private sector insurers, because you buy private insurance through the Obamacare exchanges, and it expanded Medicaid. So they didn't do exactly, what we wanted, but you got to live with that. Had to live with that reality.
What do you think are some of the most important aspects of the Affordable Care Act now? Yeah,
so for me, it's obvious that it is pre-existing conditions, right? I mean, like I said, if I didn't have a job or a husband with a job and I had to go buy my own health insurance, no one wants to sell a health policy to a diabetic who's had numerous eye surgeries, and right? So you've got to have protections where people like me can buy a plan, and we should all contribute, but we should all share in the risk too. So the pre-existing conditions is probably the most important thing. Being able to keep your children on your policies. I was able to stay on my parents' policy because I was a college student in my 20s, but if you weren't a college student, you couldn't. So that's been important too.
So as part of the Affordable Care Act, states were given the ability to expand Medicaid, something that not all states did, but Iowa did under Governor Terry Branstad's administration, something that the Register supported. How has that benefited Iowa?
Yeah, so, right, when you think about how did Obamacare insure people, it was these exchanges, right, that allow people to buy their own insurance, and then insuring more people through Medicaid. So, a young male who was mentally ill would not have been eligible for Medicaid before. And now, he is eligible for Medicaid. So in Iowa, it's allowed, more than 100,000 people to get health insurance. And when you think about it, it's not just about those people. Now you have previously uninsured people who hospitals are being paid to take care of. And Broadlawns is an example. I mean, Broadlawns is given credit to Medicaid, saying, they were able to expand their mental health services because they're being paid now to treat people. So it's been a good thing for Iowa, the Medicaid expansion.
But the Register has strongly editorialized against Branstad's decision to then turn over management of Medicaid to private for-profit companies, which happened in April 2016. It was those editorials that were specifically cited by the Pulitzer judges in awarding you the prize. And I'll quote, "For examining in a clear, indignant voice, free of cliche or sentimentality, the damaging consequences for poor Iowa residents of privatizing the state's administration of Medicaid." So tell us why you think that decision has been so damaging.
Yeah. I mean, the government is better at than the private sector at some things. Not everybody wants to believe that, but the truth is, Medicaid under state control had low administrative costs. It paid providers on time. It pays low reimbursements to providers. They complain about it all the time, but that's how it controls costs. And so the system was not broken, despite what politicians wanted people to believe. And you don't need to be a healthcare expert to realize that when you hand over a system to for-profit insurers, including United Health Group, whose revenues last year were $200 billion in 2017. When you hand that system over to people who want to make a profit, they're going to try to make a profit. And so from the very beginning, we were skeptical about it. And we've now, Jason Clayworth and Tony Lays and the editorial page, we've run a lot of stories showing the kinds of problems people are having, not getting care, providers closing because they're not paid. So it hasn't been good for the state.
We're about ready to finish with my questions for Andie. If you do have questions, please write them on those cards and start passing them to the aisles. This will be my last general question, and then I have a little story I want to tell about Andie. So I've talked about all the research you do, the federal government's General Accountability Office, the Congressional Research Service, those are frequent go-tos, the Kaiser Family Foundation, which does lots of research on healthcare topics. You've literally interviewed hundreds of Iowans in the past 17 years about their health care. So what's your overall vision on how healthcare should work in this country?
Yeah, I'm still an advocate in a lot of ways of a single-payer type system. I think one way we've talked that it could even be done is expanding Medicare, over time. I mean, if you covered people now 65 and up and just moved it over time, 64 years old, 63 years old, we have to have a system that isn't driven by profit. Healthcare is such a basic, we're a wealthy country, and it's such a basic need that I think, something more like a universal system. Everybody contributes and everybody shares in the risk.
So do send your cards to the aisles with questions. Lots of people have asked me about that day when it was announced that Andie had won the Pulitzer, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. So first of all, here's kind of how the judging works. So juries of judges gather in New York City to judge the Pulitzer Prizes, and there are usually about 1,100 entries in 14 journalism categories. The jury for editorial writing consists of 5 judges, and they recommend 3 finalists to forward then to the Pulitzer board. And then the Pulitzer board always meets in early April in New York City to decide then the actual prize winners for the 14 categories. All of this is done under the strictest of confidentiality, but somehow it always seems that as the announcement grows near, somehow tongues loosen a little, and papers will kind of get word that, oh, we heard that so-and-so is a finalist for the prize. So I had been told by the grapevine that sounded like we were going to be at least a finalist in editorial writing. So I went in it was a Monday, and first of all, I had a little bit of a dilemma. I mean, I can be a little superstitious about things like awards because I don't want to believe until it actually happens. But the other complication was that I knew that two submissions of work from our staff were entered in editorial writing. Clark Kaufman, also on our staff, his editorials were being judged as well. So even if we were a finalist, let alone the winner, I didn't know which of two it might be. So I ended up telling both Clark and Andie that I'd heard this pretty good rumor that maybe something really nice would happen that day. And in the meantime, so Andie usually works at home through much of the week. She comes in for the Monday editorial board, then she goes home. And as usual, she went home to start writing editorials. But I made her promise, well, if you win the Pulitzer Prize, you have to come back to the newsroom so that we can have a celebration and do a toast. Now, in the meantime, I am really nervous. I was doing things like I had our online staff prep 2 separate stories. We had looked at all the editorials that Clark had entered and that Andie had entered. I looked at them both and I thought, Clark's were all focused on various actions of the Trump administration, and they were very forceful. And I thought, oh, I could see that winning. And then I looked at Andie's and thought, oh, I could see that winning. So I had no idea. So the actual announcement comes via a live stream on the web. So I was in my office just glued to the screen. David Shivers, our publisher, was in his office doing the same thing. He says that he sort of let out a whoop. I didn't hear that. I went out straight to the middle of the newsroom and just said to the whole room, Andie Dominick just won a Pulitzer. And everyone sort of erupts. And so I told everyone, I made her promise she'd come back into the newsroom and we'll have a celebration. Well, little did I know, when you're covering breaking news, we always say in the business that, every minute matters. Well, minutes are passing by, and I just assumed that Andie would have been watching this announcement. But what were you doing?
I was working on Sunday's editorial with you. But then someone texted me from the newsroom.
It was actually Clark finally had to text her, and then it was like, oh no. And then
they got dressed and then came back in.
But it's so classic Andie that, all this stuff is going on and she's working on an editorial. The other funny little thing is that I had said, it was one time when I was very glad that the publisher overruled me, because I first said, oh no, human resources will never let us have champagne in the newsroom. And Davis said, yes, you can. So we were able to do a champagne toast.
Yeah, that was nice. Yeah.
I'll take some cards. Okay.
We got to give her time to filter them, too. Take your time there, Carol.
Well, here's an easy one, although we usually don't divulge what editorials we're working on, but this one just says, what's exciting that you're working on now?
Yeah, I was just reading today I was just reading the Social Security and Medicare trustees report from last week. So I was working on that, and then this isn't exciting though, but just Medicaid and I'm bad like this. I compartmentalize, like I work on something, and then if you ask me what I wrote last week, I can't still remember. So,
this is something that we wrote about. You started to take on last week on editorials. How hard would it be for the state to take back Medicaid?
Yeah, we wrote. Finally, after a few years of this, we wrote an editorial yesterday, kind of explaining exactly what needed to be done. This isn't, and I think even the headline said this isn't rocket science. I mean, Medicaid was operated by the state many years. And after the Democratic gubernatorial candidates had a debate a couple weeks ago, and a few of them were saying this could take years, that it was so complicated. I did run by a former Medicaid director and an insurance executive my understanding of all this, and it's really not very hard. The infrastructure is still in place at Iowa Medicaid Enterprise. The employees, the documents, they would need to rebid contracts and do things, but we can go back and do what the state did for decades. It's not that difficult. And a governor can do it without legislative approval. So, which is what Branstad did, right? I mean, if you think back on this, I mean, Branstad privatized Medicaid without legislative approval. Unlike some states, Iowa doesn't have a provision in law that requires that. Florida is a good example where Jeb Bush privatized Medicaid, but Florida law has a provision that those things cannot be implemented without legislative approval, like when they get a waiver. So in Florida, it ended up taking him 10 years to privatize Medicaid across the state. In Iowa, a governor can secure a federal waiver and implement that waiver, which is what was done to privatize Medicaid without legislative approval. So,
have you ever had to write an editorial that represented the editorial board's opinion but not your personal opinion? And how does that work?
I think I've refused to write 2 editorials. And I don't know that I'm going to say what they are. but one of them was an endorsement. And one of them was, I can't remember, there were a couple times, but no, I haven't really had to do that.
I think this is fairly common. Lynn Hicks, a former opinion page editor, is here, and Randy Evans, a few of us who've held that chair. My philosophy was that if we ever came to that much of a stalemate, that the editorial page editor would write it, because you wouldn't force one of your staff to do that. But there are editorials you write that you kind of hold your nose a little bit.
I asked that question, Carol.
Yeah, that's true. That's funny. That's right. Kathy Obradovich, our current opinion editor. This gets down into the weeds a little bit, but you do this all the time. What will happen if Medica pulls out of the Affordable Care Act exchange?
Yeah, I don't know. But Walmart, where's Tony? Walmart will offer next year. My go-to. So we'll have another insurer next year, but yeah, you need a few insurers so that people have choices.
She was motioning over here to Tony Lays, who has covered hundreds of Medicaid and editorials, news stories in his time. So Medica ended up being the sole insurer in this current year, but Wellmark has said that it will go back into the exchange, which would be a welcome thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Can't quite read this one. I'm gonna skip that one.
That's right.
Why is healthcare so much more expensive than it is in Europe? Is it because the administration is more expensive?
In Europe? I'm not really as familiar with all countries' systems, but I mean, you can see anecdotally, an example is, Canada. I mean, Trump was just talking about this, that they won't pay, the higher prices for drugs. So sometimes it's a matter of rationing and a matter of governments or health systems just won't pay as much for pharmaceuticals. People don't like to talk about it, but to control healthcare costs, you don't have very many options. You can use less care, right? You can pay less for it. And these are tough choices, but if you're honest about it, people can't, you know, you have to use less health care. You have to pay less for services. So I think other countries have done that better than we have.
This is a question just about kind of the climate today. In this age of anonymous vitriol online, how do you as an editorial writer kind of sift through all that in search of meaningful comments? Or do you just try to shut them out?
Oh, from readers' comments?
Yeah. Or experts, but probably
I think, yeah, the bigger issue is finding reliable information, right? So using the GAO, using sources you trust, and yeah, online you kind of have to ignore. So, I mean, there are some legitimate points, but there are mean people out there too, right? I mean, just people who, you know, just want to attack you, or so you have to kind of just let that go.
This is a more general question. Andie, I too am a lifelong Iowan. I'd be interested in your perspective of the Iowa today versus the Iowa of yesterday, say the 60s, 70s, 80s. It seems that our values have changed, as have our politics. Do our values drive our politics or vice versa?
I'm not sure I know anymore. I think I would have used to say our values drive our politics, but it's a crazy time in this country right now. I'm not sure. I know what you mean, though, and I think Iowans are really good people at heart and want to do the right thing. We may not always agree, but I think we want to do the right thing. But we do need to clean up our water, and you know, we need to do some things in this state. So some things have to change. But.
I don't know that we know the answer to this, but I'll give you a try. Again, it's like a little bit in the weeds question about Medicaid. You mentioned problems with actuarial tables and long-term care insurance, since Medicaid is the only payer of long-term care, well, it often is. How do problems with actuarial tables impact the projected cost savings the state has cited with Medicaid and managed care? I don't know that we know enough to know that.
I'm not sure I understand exactly what. I mean, Medicaid pays about half the nursing home bills in this state. I'm not sure I understand the rest of that. No.
To me, it just goes to how nursing home care is very expensive, and just the inflation rate for that kind of care has been very hard and high, so that it becomes difficult for the state to kind of keep up those payments over time, and which is in a way what drove the privatization decision. Mm-hmm. I'll go ahead and ask this. How has your job changed with decreases with the register staff?
Yeah. How many of my bosses are here? 1, 2, 3. No, it's a different time. When I got that job, I mean, we had a really large staff. We write fewer editorials, which I think is the right move. I think we should spend more time on fewer editorials. We don't want to be one of those papers that cranks out meaningless commentary, and those exist. So, but it's tough. Maybe we could hire some people. I'm just kidding. It's for me.
Someone's asking about the process that you go through. Well, and the process again with the Pulitzer, and how were those chosen? I mean, that was kind of between, I think, Lynn Hicks, the then opinion editor, had to look through some of those. You looked through
how the
some
editorials were
Yeah.
chosen? Yeah, I think in the editorial category in Pulitzer, you can submit up to 10 items, is how it's phrased, which sounds like it would mean 10 editorials, but you're never sure. Like if you have a sidebar or so I think we may have chosen 9 editorials, and the tendency is to select them by theme. So the larger theme was healthcare. And I think we just went through, and Lynn probably did most of this, and chose 9 editorials. But interestingly, you can win for 1 editorial. I mean, you could submit them, but the judges can say you've won for this editorial. So that Pulitzer, the way it was written, the way the judges wrote it, it was for only, the Medicaid editorials. We also submitted editorials on vaccines and the fetal tissue research and the Trump administration, Obamacare changes, things like that. But
someone's asking about your plans for what's next and any future career plans, but I don't want to go there.
I don't think about that. At home, I have a thistle to write for Saturday, and I have an editorial to write for Sunday, I think.
That's good.
That's how, those are my plans right now.
Kathy and I will just keep giving you editorial assignments to write about, and you keep digging up your own. This is from a former foster parent. What additional safeguards do you think could be implemented to prevent abuse of the children in foster care?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do care a lot about this issue. I think particularly, that you do need to keep track of where kids are, particularly if families are receiving subsidies or if kids, are still on Medicaid, that there has to be something in place where you just know the child, someone knows the child exists. And one of the things we pushed for on the editorial page is ensuring kids are enrolled in schools, whether they're homeschooled or not, but that a school is aware of them. Iowa a few years ago, as part of the education reform, allowed what's called independent private instruction, where you can pull your child out of school and you don't even have to say anything to the school. You never have to answer another question about that child. And now in Iowa, a kid can literally disappear. And these are not the traditional homeschoolers. Independent private instruction is a different thing. And it's dangerous. The school is a place also where kids are kept track of. We know they exist, when the school system knows they exist. So there's some changes like that I think Iowa should consider.
Another question here. Mental health care is a chronic, incurable condition like diabetes. What's your vision for what the mental health system should be like?
Well, hopefully some of these legislative changes will help. I think it's very important to integrate mental health into the traditional healthcare system. You think, how crazy is it that we had a county-based mental health system? We don't have a county-based heart disease system, right? We don't have county-based anything. And so we've had to transition out of that compartmentalizing mental health into kind of a separate thing too. That's how this country that's how it was. And so I think it's really important also to integrate it into the whole healthcare system.
This is, I'm gonna have to wrap up these questions. I'm getting the time's up sign. So this one's a nice, that has a compliment embedded in the question. You have been blessed with a mind that thinks clearly, logically, and critically. You also were an instructor at Iowa State. What can schools do to train, teach, and instill clear thinking?
Oh yeah, we need to do that. I'm not sure. I'll get back to you on that. Thank you.
Before we let Andie go, I'm going to call David Shivers back up. He has a little something for Andie.
Is this the surprise I heard about the Nomadone?
This is the poorly kept surprise.
I didn't.
This is for you.
This really is a surprise. I don't know anything about it. Should I open it now?
Please.
Let's see.
We double wrapped it, I guess.
Just to make it difficult. Build up the suspense.
The Saturday Night Live skit. Oh, wow. Hold on, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
you. I'll do that.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks again so much. There were lots of other good questions in the stack, but time was a wasting. Andie will be here, and please go to the tables, the resource tables. I want to thank Des Moines University for providing the space, and one more round of applause for our 2018 winners.